At this time, I'll have Stacy Jibb and Stefan Lemon from Invest Durham come to the podium, and they'll deliver our final presentation of the day before we move to the farmer panel. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mitch. Hi, everyone. My name is Stacy Jibb. I'm the manager of agriculture. Testing. Okay, perfect. Good. Hi, everyone. My name is Stacy Jibb. I'm the manager of agriculture and rural economic development with the region of Durham. Joined today by Stefan Lemon, who is our agriculture economic development specialist. So you've heard a little bit about business planning. You've heard about the planning policy side of things. And now we're going to talk a little bit more about the economic development side of things. And we're going to dig a little bit more into the application toolkit and checklist that you all have on your tables. So just make sure you have this handy because we will go through it in more detail. But without further ado, we'll get into things. So you've heard from Cody and Robin already around what agriculture-related and on-farm diversified uses are. So I'm not going to go into these in detail in any way, but really they were the focus of the study. And for today, we're going to be spending a lot of time probably talking about the OFDU side of things. So just to kick things off, why might someone think to diversify their farm? So a number of reasons. One of the most common really is that economic viability piece. So it's an opportunity to introduce new revenue streams on your farm. This helps you sort of diversify, spread out your risk. It's also a great tool for succession planning, so a way for the next generation of agriculture to join in on an operation. Often they bring a new skill set that can lend itself well to OFDUs, and it's a great opportunity to help keep family farms economically viable into the future. It's also a great way to preserve local history and heritage. A lot of times we'll see maybe heritage structures being preserved as part of an OFDU, or sort of bringing to light local history as part of an OFDU idea. Of course, it helps to maximize the use of land. So maybe an OFDU could be on an area that you're not really using in agricultural production. So you can sort of utilize that land as well. And of course, a response to consumer trends. So we saw a lot of this during COVID, people interested in coming to farms. Where can they buy local food? How can they learn about where their food comes from? And really creating that greater connection between the general public and farming and where their food comes from.
Okay, so this slide does highlight the key first steps for anyone considering going through the OFDU process. So start with your idea and business planning, like Teresa mentioned in her presentation earlier, that align with your farm goals and that will be economically viable to do as well. So you can reach out to your economic development staff at the region, like me and Stacy at Invest Durham, to go over the application toolkit and checklist for your OFDU idea. You will then do some work with the Township Planning staff to get comments and feedback on potential requirements and challenges before investing significant time and money into your OFDU. Also, make sure to check out investdurham.ca/on-farm diversification, which does have your checklist, your toolkit, and frequently asked questions as well that answer a lot of questions related to ARUs and OFDUs. And a site plan is also required, so therefore make sure to work on this through whether it's Ontario Ag Maps or another way where you can clearly show the plans, the measurements of what you aim to have processed on your OFDU. So I will talk a little bit about the application toolkit. So the toolkit is designed to help applicants understand the OFDU process before they submit an application. So you can see that in front of you. The toolkit, the first 20 or so pages really break down a lot of the different guidelines and things that you will need to maybe make yourself familiar with before going through this process. It does provide an overview of the types of on-farm businesses that may be permitted and outlines all the information you will need to gather for the checklist, which follows the toolkit in this booklet here. It highlights and explains when building permits may be required and identifies other potential considerations such as development charges, noise bylaws, and other municipal requirements. And ultimately, it brings together key resources and points of contact so applicants can be more informed when starting the application process. And then moving towards the application toolkit, which we will go through very shortly. I believe it starts on page 24. So the application checklist is a fillable PDF online as well as in the book that's in front of you. So it is very easy to go through on your computer. There are questions about existing uses on the property, current buildings, specific business activities being proposed, and so on. You will also be asked to provide information about neighboring properties and expected operation impacts, such as traffic, parking, and site access. For OFDUs, a farm business registration number is required to be provided, as well as estimated size calculations of everything proposed and details on activities like whether you're hosting events, or you're going to be preparing food on site, and so on. So the goal of the checklist is really just to ensure that applications are complete, allowing staff to review proposals more efficiently and identify any requirements early on in the process so that everyone's on the same page.
Awesome. So we're just going to open up the checklist and go through it all so you can sort of have a little bit of a better understanding about what's being asked and sort of some of the rationale behind some of that. So as Stefan mentioned, it starts on page 24 of the booklet you've got there. So really the first page is asking about if your property is an active agricultural use, because we really need to discern that this is a viable agricultural operation and sort of primary agriculture is happening there as long as you're looking at an OFDU. Also asks sort of the next part about agricultural buildings or structures on the property, what they are. So this would be things like greenhouses, livestock facilities, grain storage, implements sheds, anything that's sort of used as part of the ongoing agricultural operation. Also asks some questions about whether there's a residence on the property. So maybe you're going to use that for office space for something, for instance. So that's something we need to know. And then it proceeds to ask you to sort of detail out what the various uses are. So agricultural uses, agricultural related uses, and then any existing on-farm diversified uses. So all that can be found in the front of this toolkit as well. So you can sort of refer back to that as you're going through the checklist. And then any other uses that might be on the property. So that could be things like, is there a forest? Is there a wetland? Maybe there's a utility corridor or some sort of easement on the property. And then we're asking sort of what type of business or land use is being proposed. So this is a pretty important one to help staff understand sort of what is the meat of your application. So describe in nature, try to be clear, try to be direct about what you're really proposing on your property. That helps us understand sort of next steps for the application process. Then we do ask about surrounding neighboring property uses. So Cody and Robin touched on this a little bit, but it's important to help mitigate any issues with sort of neighbors. We want to balance various interests in the area and just sort of look at what else is happening around you and whether what you're doing supports that or hinders that. Then we sort of get into some information about traffic. So asking sort of peak traffic per day, average traffic, if sort of the nature of your use does require people or visitors to come onto the property, it's important for us to know that. And then describing how traffic will be managed. So if it's something like a event venue, for instance, maybe you're going to have parking attendants or you're going to have really good signage or anything like that is important to share. And then just some information about sort of what the road's like. Is it paved? What's the infrastructure like? And then maybe sort of for us to determine how vehicle traffic can be managed and how that might impact the road and sort of where you're located and what type of road it is. Then we get into traffic access and things sort of continuing to talk about the volume of traffic and what types of vehicles. So maybe it's delivery trucks, maybe it's just cars, all those sorts of things. And then we start to get into sort of, again, more information about potential impacts associated with this new use. So we don't want to hinder surrounding agricultural operations. We want to ensure we're protecting agricultural production. So that's a really important piece of all of these policies, is that agricultural continues to be sort of the primary use on the property for an OFDU. So moving on to page 27, again, we're sort of asking for information about how it relates to or supports surrounding agricultural businesses in the area. How do you benefit from being close to those types of businesses? So just looking for you to provide as much detail as you can around all of those sorts of things. And then we get into a little bit of information about sort of requirements for private sewage or septic systems, and that may require involvement from the Durham Region Health Department. So that's important for us to know, and we can connect you with the right people if that's needed. And then sort of whether you're going to need to install a new septic system or all of those sorts of things are important to know because that may require a building permit, for instance. And then, of course, the well. Do you have a well? Is it existing? When did you last test your water? All those sorts of things are questions we're going to be asking and looking for as part of the process. And then on the bottom of page 27 is really when it gets a bit more specific for on-farm diversified uses. So if you're just an agriculture-related use, you don't have to fill out this section, but if you're an OFDU specifically, you would continue on with filling in this section of the checklist. So the first question here is really around that farm business registration number requirement. So we are asking you to provide that. If you don't have a farm business registration number currently, you can get an exemption from Agricorp. So there's a link in the checklist for you to be able to follow that. From what our understanding is, you can apply for an exemption up to 3 years, and then the expectation is that you will be able to obtain your farm business registration number. So we'll be asking for you to sort of, if you're going the exemption route, sort of show us that you've gotten that and you've obtained that from Agricorp. And then we're asking for more detail here around the specific OFDU. What are aspects of the business that are an OFDU? Is there anything on the property that might already be an OFDU? So as Cody and Robin mentioned, you can have more than one type of use, but it all has to sort of fall into that 2% or 1 hectare requirement. Then we're going to ask some information about sort of laneways, proposed parking, and all of that sort of will feed into that size calculation. So there is more information on page 11 of this toolkit in terms of how you calculate that size requirement for on-farm diversified uses. And then, as Stefan mentioned, that will all need to be reflected in a site plan. So Ontario Ag Maps is a great tool to use because you can sort of have your calculations in there, and that will help you sort of determine the total area of your OFDU for the checklist, because we'll want to know all that information as we go throughout the process. There is some discounts that can be applied for existing buildings or laneways. So you can read more about that in the checklist or the toolkit as well. And then touching a little bit on whether there's anything that's temporary in nature. So as was mentioned, maybe you have a tent and that's going to be sort of your business plan for the first few years. So you use a tent as opposed to building a structure. You can sort of test out your business idea that way. Then we're asking information about visitors, so sort of daily, hourly, weekly, what you expect that to be. And hopefully if you've gone through the business planning process, you'll have some of that information and that should be fairly easy to answer. And then there is some event-specific questions. So sort of asking around like what kind of building or structure are you going to be using? What is the total area? So just keeping in mind 200 meters square is sort of what we're looking for event spaces. And then what kind of events you're going to be doing, how many people, all that sort of information. And then the last sort of questions are really around, preparing, selling, or serving food to the public. So that's an important piece that the health department would want to know as well. So that's really the nuts and bolts of the toolkit. Of course, Stefan and I are here to help walk you through that. So we've done a number of these already where we'll sit down with farm applicants and we'll go through this with them. Sometimes we even help them fill it out. So certainly we're here to help you go throughout that process. So don't feel like you have to just tackle this on your own. A few other considerations just quickly, because this has been touched on already. Of course, there may be impacts to your property taxes. So that's something you need to keep in mind. That's why we have someone from MPAC here. So if you have specific property tax implication questions, great to ask them today. We can't necessarily answer those, and that is more of an MPAC sort of question, but something to keep in mind. Development charges, or DCs, as you may hear us talk about, has been something that's often unexpected by a lot of applicants because typically municipalities offer an exemption for agricultural uses. And once we start talking about on-farm diversified uses, they may be considered commercial or industrial in nature, and then you might be looking at development charges. So something to keep in mind as you're sort of business planning and just may want to know about. So speak with your local municipality or reach out to us if you have questions about that. Entrance permits or upgraded entrance requirements may be needed depending on traffic and sort of how many people are going to be visiting. The site plan and size calculations for OFDUs. Again, that's all outlined on page 11 of the toolkit, so make sure you read that, but it does require some math and you do have to do some calculations. So it's good to get comfortable and understand what that's asking, so you can sort of do that to the best of your abilities. And then health department compliance. So if you're looking at a petting zoo, for instance, that does require, there is some guidelines from the health department. We can make sure you have copies of those. And then selling, preparing, or serving food. And then, as I mentioned, any sort of septic requirements that you might have. Finally, resources. Yeah, sure.
Some resources to go through are through the OFA, some guidelines for permitted uses, such as Dr. Wayne Caldwell's paper, and funding and financing options. If you do reach out to Invest Durham, I do have a document I can share with a lot of different funding and financing options that we're happy to share. And then economic development staff, whether that is reaching out directly to Stacy and I at our emails, which we will pop up later, and we are happy to send this presentation around, or visiting investdurham.ca, especially on the webpage regarding OFDUs, where it breaks down, like I said, the FAQs. It has the link to this toolkit and checklist and a lot of other information that you can find regarding this project. Thank you very much, and we're happy to take some questions. Oh, one back there, actually.
Just to clarify on the FBR requirement, if you're leasing out the land to a different farmer, you could use their FBR. Is that possible, or does it have to be related to the OFDU in ownership or family, or how do you deal with all of that?
So there are, like, it's not a perfect requirement, obviously. We're learning that there are some hurdles to overcome with that requirement. Ideally, when we put this in place, we envisioned it as like, you couldn't have your FBRN if you're just renting it out to someone. So ideally, we'd like the applicant to have the FBRN for them. Yes. But I mean, there is certainly some loopholes with this one as we're learning, and we may have to sort of relook at how it's being applied and if it's achieving its intent, but that's what we're asking for right now. Yeah. There you go. She sees, yeah. Perfect.
So with what you're doing, and I appreciate it, sounds very good. Is there direct communication between you folks right now, OMAFRA, for example, and the Impact as well as Revenue Canada? Because what you're saying here sounds amazing, but then when you're talking about, well, it's not a perfect system yet, would Revenue Canada actually see this direct farm-related income instead of complete capital gains?
We haven't had any conversations with Revenue Canada. Like, I don't have any interaction with them. We have spoken to Agricorp directly in like the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Agribusiness. So they're definitely aware of it. And we've had a number of conversations around sort of asking for that FBRN piece and what that looks like and the implications of that. But in terms of sort of beyond that at the federal level, there hasn't been like, that's not really, I think, a space that we're getting into. Yeah.
Got someone put their hand up there. Anyway, sorry. I think you may have answered or I missed that, but the question really, so there are two types of business. You said on-farm business and other is farm-related and doesn't necessarily need to be on the farm property.
Like Robin touched on this, an agriculture-related use doesn't necessarily have to be on a farm, but an on-farm diversified use must be on a farm.
Yeah, so like, what was the, sorry, I'm getting confused. So the farm-related business don't necessarily need to be on the farm, right?
Right, so that could be like a grain dryer operation or a grain elevator. It doesn't necessarily have to be located on a farm, but it has to support the surrounding agricultural.
So, okay, so if I want to start that business, I can lease some land available, even commercial land or whatever land is available, and I can put that operation there. Say, repair.
I mean,
Right, a farm tractor repair.
theoretically, an agriculture-related use could be on a property that's not zoned agricultural. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. It can be on agriculture zone or any other zoning like rural.
Yeah, it's like very dependent on the scope and scale and what exactly it is. But yes, could be on agricultural property. I think there is some rules about like for a grain dryer or grain handling facility specifically, it has to have like typically you're doing that for your own products. Otherwise it becomes like a more commercial type of facility. If you have specific questions, we can certainly take that offline, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a general question I don't have, but I'm trying to get it clear, clarity on those things. Thank you.